And to show also the Studiolo show, and maybe what you said, the making of, like this would be my next question. How do you maneuver between this making of that seems like very productive because it's this open door of possibilities and kind of the final work? Because also in the exhibition To the Moon via the Beach, it was this idea of it being like a studio, which is often an idea of an exhibition that is hard to fulfill by an artist, but you actually did it while shooting a movie in there. And when you came the first time to Zurich and did the show with us, the space was actually called Studiolo, so it also became your studio. It was the actual place where you lived and produced the work. But then
I slept right there next to the table. Yeah.
You recycled but then you had to maneuver it to an exhibition. So how do you like relate between the studio that often seems very present in your work and the exhibition?
I think perhaps like one of the hardest things for me, is let's actually go back. But before I'm saying what's really hard for me, a lot of what I do, as you can see in this photo, for example, has to do with flat surfaces, like places of work. So it can be the studio, which we're discussing at the moment. It can be a piece of paper or the flat surface like this, which was a desk at some point, or what you're looking at right now as a place where I poured the material, which, in the end of it, I'm obviously not the first to do that, but becomes in itself the work. So the definition of where the work begins and where it ends can be present in a table, and it can be present between the tables in what we call the studio and or the gallery. Specifically with me, I have this interest in, it started with the relationship to education, or me remembering what it was to be a student in school or in high school and before, in middle school and the beginning of school, where two kids were sitting on a table, and I would look at the tables, and what tables would have a line in the middle. So it would have some sort of like archaeology of a social situation under the power of education. Two kids sitting next to each other, one child tell to the other, like, okay, you can't cross this line. So there's a architectural and a social division between two kids, but there's a formal mark on it, art making, if you will, on a table. Another table has a hole in it because, there's a kid that likes to dig with his pencil. In my case, it usually was drawings, right? So again, this is how you sort of like occupy a space. Here, you see here, all these tables. And then in terms of the transformation from the studio to the gallery, it's something that was always very, very hard for me because, the materials, here you see there's gloves. Sorry about the noise in the studio behind me. The gloves, for instance, were work gloves that I worked with, making possibly something next to this, but they end up on the sculpture. So for me to have that be removed from the artwork itself is another process of decision making. And in that sense also, this studio, I had to, in Studiolo, I had to decide what stays and what goes. And of course, in the end, I decided that there's enough of the studio in the works themselves, so the studio doesn't have to, so the gallery, in what we see in these photos, doesn't need to look like a studio anymore. It's actually better that it looks like a place to show art, to present art, with a notion of the history that we know within each work. Yeah, and it's something that I believe that I did better than other times, in the past, in my very short history as an artist, relatively, right? And because there were definitely shows that got more attention or less attention, but also sometimes more attention, which I'm less happy about the transformation from the studio to the space. I almost felt it's like a bit too artificial studio in the gallery, despite the fact that I never really did it. I never transformed the gallery into my studio. right? We also all know very well, like, of great examples of how people do it. And, one of the best examples is very close to us physically at the moment, and in history of, like, for instance, like Fischli and Weiss, creating the artificial studio as a marker of history. So it's almost like, and I learned a lot from that, or works like that. And in that sense, also, like, the notion of artificiality is important for me. Not to hide from that, but to play with that and to heighten that. I actually believe it's very similar for me. I mean, maybe I'll take it to somewhere that's a bit more confusing, right? But, I'm looking at Hollywood or movies or period movies. I don't understand why they always use the actual makeup and costumes that they believe was the costume of the time. That's one thing. Even more so, why would they use some sort of like pseudo-Shakespearean English? Why, when they play Napoleon, they would use a pseudo-Shakespearean accent? Why, when they, it's always, or even in science fiction or... Anyways, I'm going to cut it here for a second. Do you want me to ask them to be quiet? Is this really bad?
No, it's okay, I think.
Oh, no.
Yeah?
It's okay.
But going back to the studio, yeah, like also in the recent show at Gavin's, I felt like the space itself is so, that's the first floor. Some of it looks more like a gallery and some is more raw. Mm-hmm. And of course, and I thought, the combination of Gavin's sensitivities and my sensitivities in terms of the space and the art, if we play too much into the romanticism of both the art and the space, we will turn out with a vulgar byproduct. And I thought it was very important to be careful not to show too much of the spontaneous, in quotation marks, mess in the gallery, but rather to try and keep the spirit of the studio in terms of the search and how those pieces were made, but to pick and choose what's best for the space and to organize it like an exhibition. And it's called House, and it has the connotation of many different things. And again, like I said before, contextualizing it both formally and socially in a way that I thought was serving the show, but it's an art show, and it's not supposed to be, I'm not Mike Nelson or other great artists that, do environments. This was an exhibition in a gallery. Or still is, behind the closed doors, but it is.
And this drawing we just see now, I think it was really at the beginning of the show.
Yeah,
and again, it really feels like a kind of, again, like a blueprint, like a section for the house one will encounter. And I saw one of the videos, I think, which is on another floor. It's called Take This, for example. And there Harry also kind of describes a kind of a traditional sense of a house, of a home, where he would speak about the parents' bedroom, the children's bedroom, and how the kind of the spatial choreography would work.
Yeah, he's speaking about the allocation of rooms in a house with a normal family.
Yep, and as you say, the house in this sense, or the architecture, is really a highly educated term, and it's full of politics even, and tension. So it's already, it even implies an almost oppressive system behind it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. I think, the sort of tension between the delivery and the context and the actual text is problematic, and obviously at some point ridiculous or humorous. And at the same time, of course, asks itself questions,
Could I play a little bit of the video?
Mm-hmm.
Some years ago, I went out for a loaf of bread at my local bakery. Walking down the street afterwards, with the paper packet under my arm, I had the strangest feeling that something was very wrong. I went back to the store and demanded to speak to the manager. "Look here," I said. "I just bought this loaf of bread from you, but I have this feeling. I have this feeling that nothing in the world is quite right." When I arrived at your store earlier, I was happy and content. Leaving with my bread, everything was wrong.
In this part, it's hairy, and in this part is basically, there's like a long segment, relatively long segment in the beginning about basically him wanting something and being happy with the potential or the promise of some service that he might get, and then the disappointment or the sort of like discord or lack of fulfillment in terms of his expectations. If it's at the bakers or the butchers or the fishmonger or what have you, in terms of different shopkeepers, craftsmen, and it's almost like him, trying this, trying that, this sort of, how I feel, what I want, what I believe, and this sort of like pleasant delivery that he gives us from behind the bar. Again, obviously artificial, and the handle in the background.
One thing I wondered about is this, like the bread or the fish or the house, like this notion of the common denominator that is like these, at the same time, small and big things, like big concepts, but also very personal concepts that we relate to, that are so big, but they always have a very personal memory or story to us. Is this something you're interested in?
I think it has to do maybe with, first of all, yes, of course. It's like I said before, or like I think you mentioned about like a passport photo, right? So even if we don't know exactly who it is, we recognize it as such. It's a human face. It's an animal face. We understand the gender. We understand the age. We understand the gaze, even though we don't know who exactly it is. So these are patterns, right? Mm-hmm. And in that sense, I think it comes from the child's world. If you look at like a very basic kids, sometimes more educational, sometimes less, but like stories, there's always like a shopkeeper. There's there are different trades. There's like a butcher. What is it called? Mr. Man, the English one, right? So there's like, or even at the Smurfs, right? You have one you have different smiths, right? You have like a metalsmith, and you have like a fishmonger, and you have like a woodworker, and so on. So basically, sort of patterns, right? Obvious and familiar patterns, like the world of grown-ups, jobs, nurse, engineer, right? Definitely right now, like the essential workers. There's a uniform, people act, behave, have the ritual, the language, and the visual language in clothes of a profession. I remember like, what is it called? Mr. Papa, Mr. We used to call it Baba Abba. These guys. I still have them somewhere. I can't find it, but I have all these like toys here, but I'm moving studios. There was one that basically looked like an artist. That's the one I could identify with, because he had like, like me, kind of like probably pens with like, some paint on it or a brush, right? And he was like the creative type, right? Or he was more furry and fluffy. And then there's, the one that's the engineer, the Smurf engineer, has a pencil and like a notebook, right? So we basically learn to recognize things by their pattern, by their language, by their behavior. So I think the gap, the sort of like the promise of becoming something, of wanting, the desire to be something from a child, doing it as an adult, doing it as a grown-up, and also indulging as a grown-up that speaks like Harry speaks, speaking about what he wanted from the fishmonger and didn't receive it, and the disappointment, and maybe wanting to complain. This kind of like a petty, articulate, cultured person that's like things don't sit right for him. Maybe it has that kind of like the child's world, and also maybe some sort of like social hierarchy aspect to the whole thing. Sorry, long aspect, but
great.
But basically, there's like in all my work, there's like this everyday life humor and abjectness.
Uri, to jump in speaking of everyday life, I just see on the slideshow the New York Times which I of course didn't see in real, but I see that it's kind of a slightly, transformed real New York Times paper. But I was really intrigued seeing this one newspaper in the show, because somehow it feels like kind of an obstructing element, because I really experience your work as something that, which functions in an enclosed system or almost hermetic language system that you dive in. But here suddenly you have the New York Times as a signifier for the outside, for politics. And for me, it kind of immediately recalled, for instance, the early collages by Picasso, where he inserted newspapers into abstract painting as a kind of attack towards the autonomy of painting at the time, or he even inserted stock charts into the collages. So I was curious about this signifier for the outside, or the outside of the house, outside of the home. And of course, now everything is about news these days.
Yeah, I just basically, you see this this image of Ernie from Sesame Street, again, another sort of child's world, education world that I'm very interested in, this anthropomorphic object, in which we learn from. But Ernie, I mean, that's kind of like one of my more, I wouldn't even say iconic, but let's say reappearing images in my show, in the history of my shows, right? I mean, I use that image, or have been using it more than once in videos, in photography, or almost like punctuate my shows with this Ernie, with this sort of like taking a pause, or maybe depressed, or object, or Ernie. And I felt that it's of the moment, and in the New York Times, basically that's how I feel. This is the gesture, the emotional gesture and the physical gesture that I feel right now towards the news. I'm not, I feel there's politics in everything that I do. A lot of what we discuss and what I do has social politics elements, within. Again, if it makes a change or doesn't, I think art in general is very important. I'm not a capital P painter that, like knocks the P on your head. This is my most obvious sort of political engagement. But yeah, I mean, yesterday the New York Times was basically saying that we've reached 100,000 deaths. And this is 2 months earlier, but, with the current, wind around the world, and specifically here, or some other places that are close to me, pretty repetitive and grim image and mirror image and front view mirror and front view image. So each and every single image in the newspaper that corresponds with each and every headline, if it's about Trump or if it's about the weather, through real estate and international news and local, has my Ernie on it. Yeah, and this is an edition, and it's a large edition. I don't even remember, but basically, the viewer is welcome to come and take it home. I don't know how many people know it, and now maybe like you don't want to take it. I have to like put it like outside or like in the dry before you touch it. But yeah, but hopefully, and once and if the show will be reopened, or if I'll get a chance to make this piece again, this piece is basically relevant to each and every New York Times that I can think of from the day I even thought about this to the future. So basically, this edition can be reprinted, right? Depending on specific dates. It doesn't have to be specific to that date.
We would have more questions, but I think the moment has come for the big question of Vasilis.
Okay. So there's two questions, and you answer.
I was supposed to think about those two questions for the last 45 minutes.
You can also write it after, and we call Gehry to perform them, and then we kind of edit it in.
That's not what you asked for.
I think so. The two questions which are very related. What would you like in as things are transforming and changing, what would you wish to keep with you, take to the next stages after like lockdown, after confinement, and what would you completely wish that you could do away with and never have to kind of
Is it on a personal level or wish for the world or
for everything, for for good animals and for bad animals?
Well, it would be nice if some of the bad animals would be as clearly marked as bad, as unanimously, obviously, as vulgar or operatically represented as the bad across the board. And the good is more questionable.
Yeah. So from other animals too.
And it would be nice to move into an apartment at some point that I can have a dog again.
A dog?
Yeah, again, because like if there's something that I really realize
nice.
how much I miss that, and my we have such a desire and envy of like rooftops, porches, backyards, and so yeah, I want my animals back. Yeah.
This is great.
The good ones.
Depending. If you look at Pinocchio, for example, you'll see that what is it like? It's a fox and a cat. I think that are like more problematic. But I kind of find it interesting that sometimes in the same paradigm, or not the paradigm, but the same show or story or the same narrative, have the same animal once more anthropomorphized as good or bad, like the cat in Pinocchio. But then Geppetto has a cat as well, which is an actual cat. They have two cats, but one cat is more like human and the other cat is a cat. Anyways.
We never know if the other cat is a cat.
Exactly.